Imagine you are a sheriff in 1874. You have a wanted poster nailed to the wall of your office. The face on that poster is the most feared outlaw in the entire country. You know his name, you know his crimes, you know the reward money sitting on his head is enough to set a man up for life. But you have no idea where he is. He could be in Missouri. He could be in Kentucky. He could be 50 miles away. Or he could be right outside your door, eating breakfast at the local diner, smiling at the waitress like a man without a single worry in the world.
What'll it be, sir?
That was the genius of Jesse James. Not just that he robbed banks and trains and stagecoaches, not just that he terrorized the American frontier for over a decade, but that he vanished, over and over again, into thin air, into the dust and the hills and the farms and the forests of a country that was too big, too wild, and too divided to catch him. Lawmen chased him for years. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, the most feared private police force in America, hunted him obsessively. The government put bounties on his head. Newspapers printed his face on every front page in the nation. And still, he disappeared. So today, we are going to go somewhere most stories about Jesse James never take you. We are not just going to talk about the robberies. We are not just going to talk about the shootouts. We are going to follow Jesse James into the shadows, into the caves and the farmhouses and the river hollows and the forgotten valleys where he hid from the world. Because the story of Jesse James is not only a story about crime, it is a story about survival, about a man who understood the land, the people, and the silence better than any sheriff ever could. And what you are about to find out is that the greatest weapon Jesse James ever had was never a gun. It was a secret. To understand how Jesse James hid, you first need to understand who he was and where he came from. Because this was not a man who became an outlaw by accident. He was shaped by one of the most violent and traumatic periods in American history. Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri. He grew up on a hemp farm, the son of a Baptist minister and a strong-willed mother named Zerelda. His family were slaveholders, deeply tied to the Southern way of life, and when the Civil War erupted in 1861, it split the country in half and tore Missouri apart in ways that went beyond anything a map could show. Missouri was a border state. It did not officially join the Confederacy, but it was filled with Southern sympathizers. And in the hills and farms of Clay County, the war was not just political, it was personal. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Families were burned out of their homes. Men were dragged from their beds and executed in the fields. Jesse's older brother Frank joined a Confederate guerrilla unit led by the infamous William Quantrill. And when Jesse was barely 16 years old, Union soldiers came to the James farm looking for information about Frank's whereabouts. What happened next would define Jesse James for the rest of his life. The soldiers tortured his stepfather. They dragged him into the yard, strung him up by the neck, and beat him. They ransacked the house. And young Jesse, a teenager watching this happen to his family, felt something harden inside him that would never soften again. He joined the guerrillas not long after. He rode with Bloody Bill Anderson, one of the most violent Confederate irregulars in the entire war. He learned how to fight, how to move fast, how to survive in hostile territory, how to read a landscape and find the places where a man could disappear. He was 17 years old, and by the time the Civil War ended in 1865, Jesse James had spent his formative years learning one lesson above all others. Trust no one outside your circle. Know the land better than your enemy, and never ever stay in one place long enough to be caught. These were not lessons he learned from books, he learned them from survival. And he would use every single one of them for the next 17 years. When the war ended, the James brothers did not find peace. Missouri was occupied by Union forces. Former Confederate guerrillas were treated as criminals. Many of them could not vote, could not hold government jobs, could not even ride armed on the public roads without risking arrest. In the eyes of the law, they were already outlaws before they had robbed a single bank. So in February of 1866, a gang of former Confederate guerrillas rode into Liberty, Missouri, and robbed the Clay County Savings Bank in what historians believe was the first peacetime bank robbery in American history. $2,000 was taken. A young college student standing on the street was shot and killed in the chaos. Jesse James was likely there. He was 18 years old. What happened next is the part most people know. The robberies multiplied. Banks across Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, West Virginia. Then train robberies, a new kind of crime that captured the imagination of a nation. Bold, dramatic, terrifying. The James Younger Gang became a name that made bankers tremble and newspapers sell. But what most people do not think about is the question that haunted every sheriff and detective who ever chased them. Where did they go afterward? A gang of armed men cannot simply vanish. They have to sleep somewhere. They have to eat somewhere. They need places to rest their horses, reload their weapons, treat their wounds, and wait for the dust to settle. Every successful outlaw needs a network of safe places, a geography of secrets, and Jesse James had one of the most sophisticated and extensive hideout networks in the history of the American frontier. The first and most important piece of that network was not a cave or a remote wilderness camp. It was something far more ordinary and far more dangerous to attack. It was family. Jesse James came from a large, tight-knit extended family spread across Clay County and the surrounding regions of Missouri. Cousins, uncles, family friends, neighbors who had known the James boys since they were children. Many of them were Confederate sympathizers who had suffered through the same wartime violence. They had no love for the Union-aligned banks and railroad companies that Jesse was robbing, and they had every reason in the world to protect a member of their own when Jesse needed to disappear after a robbery. He often did not ride into the wilderness. He rode to a farm, a relative's house, a neighbor who would feed him, hide his horse, say nothing, and tell any inquiring lawman that they had not seen a soul. This was the foundation of Jesse's survival network, and it was virtually impossible for outside law enforcement to penetrate. You cannot arrest a whole county. You cannot interrogate every family in the Missouri hills. And you cannot buy the loyalty of people whose hatred for the government runs deep enough to make protecting a wanted outlaw feel like a patriotic act. Clay County, Missouri became Jesse James's home base, not because it was remote or difficult to access, but because the people there were his people. They knew him. Some of them loved him, and even the ones who feared him understood that cooperating with the law meant betraying one of their own. The Pinkerton detectives who came to Clay County learned this the hard way. They were strangers. They asked too many questions, and the community closed around Jesse like water closing over a stone. But family loyalty alone could not keep Jesse James safe forever. He needed places where he could actually disappear from sight, physical locations where no one could find him even if they were looking in the right county. And the geography of Missouri gave him exactly that. The region known as the Ozark Plateau, a vast, ancient highland of limestone bluffs, forested valleys, hidden caves, and winding rivers, stretches across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. It is some of the most rugged and confusing terrain in the central United States. The hills fold into each other in ways that disorient travelers. Streams vanish underground and resurface miles away. Narrow valleys with sheer rock walls can hide a whole camp of men from anyone passing on the higher ground above. Jesse James knew this landscape the way most men know their own backyard. One of the most well-documented of his hideout regions was the area around Merrimack Caverns, a massive cave system in the limestone bluffs along the Merrimack River in Franklin County, Missouri. The caves stretch for miles underground, with chambers large enough to shelter men and horses. The river provided water, the forest provided cover, and the cave itself provided a natural fortress. A single, narrow entrance that could be watched and defended, while the interior offered countless passages and hiding places. Local legend holds that Jesse James used Merrimack Caverns not just as an occasional stopover, but as a genuine strategic base, a place where the gang could regroup, store loot, and plan future operations. The cave's owner in later years famously promoted this connection as a tourist attraction, and while some historians debate the extent of Jesse's use of the site, What is not debatable is that caves like this one were essential to his survival strategy. The limestone regions of Missouri are riddled with such caves. Many of them are unmarked on any map. Many of them were known only to locals who had explored them since childhood, and a man who knew where those caves were and how to navigate them in darkness had a hiding place that no detective with a wanted poster was ever going to find. There was another hideout region that was even more important to Jesse James, and almost completely overlooked by the lawmen who chased him. It was the Missouri River Bluffs. The Missouri River cuts across the northern part of the state in a broad, powerful arc. For most of its length, the river is flanked by high bluffs of packed clay and limestone that rise 50, sometimes 100 feet above the water. These bluffs are carved by centuries of erosion into a labyrinth of ravines, draws, and hidden hollows, many of them completely invisible from above or from the river itself. Jesse James grew up near these bluffs. As a boy, he had explored every gully and hollow in the area around Clay County. He knew paths through the bluffs that did not appear on any survey. He knew where a man on horseback could descend to the river, cross at a shallow ford only locals knew about, and disappear into the wooded bottomlands on the other side before anyone on the main road had any idea where he had gone. After major robberies, the gang would often scatter in different directions to confuse any pursuit, then reassemble at a prearranged location in the river country. The thick forests along the bottomlands provided cover for camps that were essentially invisible from any distance, and the river itself was an escape route, a means of putting miles between the gang and any pursuers in a way that left no trail of hoofprints on solid ground. The lawmen who chased Jesse James were often good at tracking, but tracking stops at the water's edge, and Jesse James knew where every crossing was. Missouri was not the only state where Jesse James built his network of safe places. His operations ranged across a broad swathe of the country, and wherever he operated he developed connections, people and places he could rely on when things went wrong. In Kentucky, he used the rolling farmlands and dense woodlands of the western part of the state, where southern sympathies ran strong and strangers asking questions about armed men on horseback were greeted with cold stares and deliberate silence. Several farm families in the area around Adairville and Logan County were known to have sheltered the gang. And local oral tradition preserved dozens of stories about Jesse James passing through, eating a meal, resting his horse, paying generously, and leaving before dawn. In Kansas and Indian Territory, the region that would later become Oklahoma, Jesse found a different kind of sanctuary. The territory beyond the borders of Kansas was legally complex, a patchwork of tribal lands and federal jurisdiction that created gaps in law enforcement that a resourceful outlaw could exploit. The 5 civilized tribes governed their own lands with their own legal systems. A man who crossed the line into Indian Territory could be beyond the reach of Missouri or Kansas law, at least temporarily. The wooded hills along the border, the area that outlaws and desperados would later call the Nations, became a refuge not just for Jesse James, but for dozens of other wanted men in the post-Civil War era. There were settlements there, small and rough, where a man could buy food and whiskey without giving his real name, where nobody asked where you had been or where you were going. Jesse James passed through these places more than once, and each time he added to his mental map of the country, the farms, the river crossings, the cave mouths, the ravines, a geography that existed nowhere on paper, but lived in perfect detail in his own memory. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jesse James's ability to disappear was not the remote hiding places. It was the ordinary ones. There are documented periods in Jesse James's life when he was not hiding in caves or river bottoms or the hills of Indian Territory. He was living in plain sight, under assumed names, in ordinary American towns, passing himself off as a respectable citizen. In the early 1870s, Jesse lived for stretches of time in Nashville, Tennessee. He used the name J.D. Howard and rented houses in respectable neighborhoods. He and his wife Z, his cousin, whom he had married in 1874, kept a home, attended church, chatted with neighbors. He told people he was a cattle dealer or a land speculator. By all accounts, he was convincing. He was charming, Well-spoken and careful, he did not drink to excess in public. He did not get into fights. He paid his rent on time. The neighbors who later found out who their quiet, polite neighbor had actually been were uniformly shocked, not because he had seemed suspicious, but because he had seemed so completely normal. This was Jesse James at his most dangerous, not the outlaw on horseback, guns blazing, but the ordinary man sitting on the front porch reading a newspaper, smiling at passers-by. The man no one suspected because no one had any reason to look twice. Nashville was not the only city where he lived this way. He used Kansas City, St. Joseph, and other Missouri cities as cover as well. He moved frequently, never staying long enough in one place to arouse suspicion, and each time he needed to return to outlaw life when a new robbery was being planned. When the gang needed to reassemble, he simply disappeared from his ordinary life and became Jesse James again. Then, when it was over, he went back to being Mr. Howard. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been tracking Jesse James for years before they made their most famous and catastrophic mistake. Alan Pinkerton himself was obsessed with bringing Jesse James to justice. He had lost an agent. John Younger had killed Pinkerton operative Louis Lull in 1874, and the agency's reputation was on the line. Pinkerton threw resources at the problem. He sent men to Missouri. He cultivated informants. He paid for information. And on the night of January 26, 1875, he finally thought he had Jesse James cornered. Pinkerton agents had received information that Jesse and Frank James were at the family farm in Clay County, the home of Zerelda Samuel, their mother, who had remarried after their father's death. The agents surrounded the house in the dead of night. They threw an incendiary device through the window. The explosion that followed did not kill Jesse or Frank James. They were not there that night. Instead, it tore apart the arm of Jesse's mother, Zerelda, and killed his 8-year-old half-brother, Archie Samuel, who was asleep in the house. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Even people who had no sympathy for Jesse James were horrified. Newspapers that had called him a dangerous criminal suddenly ran editorials questioning the conduct of the Pinkertons. Politicians in Missouri introduced bills to offer the James brothers amnesty. The attack on the family farm, the bombing of a home, the killing of a child, the maiming of an elderly woman, transformed Jesse James in the eyes of many Americans from a criminal into something closer to a victim. It was one of the greatest gifts anyone ever gave him, because now the sympathy of the public was added to the loyalty of his neighbors and the protection of his hiding places. Jesse James was no longer just a man hiding from the law. He was a man the law had wronged, and in a country still deeply divided along Civil War lines, that story resonated powerfully. He used it. He cultivated it. He sent letters to newspapers telling his side of the story, presenting himself as a man who had been forced into outlawry by Union persecution and was now being hunted like an animal by corrupt agents of Northern capitalism. It was not entirely false, but it was also not entirely true. Jesse James was a killer. He had shot men in cold blood. He had terrorized innocent people. But he understood something about narrative that most outlaws never grasped. The story people told about you was as important as what you actually did. As the 1870s drew toward the 1880s, the pressure on Jesse James intensified. The gang was shrinking. Old friends and allies were dead or in prison. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, had been captured after the disastrous Northfield, Minnesota bank robbery in 1876, a raid that had gone catastrophically wrong and left 2 gang members dead in the streets. Jesse rebuilt around a new, younger, and less reliable group, men he did not know as well, men whose loyalty was not forged in the fires of the Civil War. And in that new gang was a man named Robert Ford. Jesse knew that the net was closing. He could feel it. Missouri's new governor, Thomas Crittenden, had made capturing Jesse James a personal crusade and had offered a reward of $10,000, an enormous sum, for Jesse dead or alive. The railroad companies were contributing to the bounty. The pressure on anyone who sheltered or helped Jesse James was growing. He had moved to St. Joseph, Missouri, living under the name Thomas Howard with his wife and children. The house on Lafayette Street was modest and quiet in a respectable neighborhood. No cave, no river hollow, no remote Ozark valley. Just an ordinary house on an ordinary street. On the morning of April 3rd, 1882, Jesse James stood on a chair in the living room of that house to straighten a picture on the wall. He had taken off his gun belt, something he almost never did, perhaps because he did not want to seem suspicious to any neighbors who might see him through the window. Robert Ford shot him in the back of the head. Jesse James died on the floor of a house he had been renting under a false name in a city that did not know who he really was. He was 34 years old. The news spread across the country like wildfire. Jesse James was dead. The most wanted outlaw in America, the man who had eluded sheriffs, detectives, and bounty hunters for 16 years, was gone. Robert Ford expected to be celebrated as a hero. Instead, he was reviled. A popular song appeared almost immediately, The Ballad of Jesse James, with a line that captured the public mood perfectly. Robert Ford had shot Jesse James from behind and laid poor Jesse in his grave. The word coward attached itself to Ford's name and never let go. He spent the rest of his life being pointed at in saloons and on street corners, whispered about, despised. Jesse James in death became something he had always cultivated in life, a legend. His body was taken back to Clay County. His mother charged curious visitors 25 cents each to see the grave. She reportedly filled the grave with rocks to prevent souvenir hunters from digging up the body, and she replaced the headstone multiple times after. People chipped pieces off as mementos. The legend grew with every year that passed. Stories multiplied. Some people claimed Jesse James had faked his death and was living under yet another assumed name somewhere in Texas or Oklahoma or Mexico. Well into the 20th century, elderly men across the Southwest came forward claiming to be the real Jesse James, still alive after all these years. None of them were. The forensic evidence, confirmed by DNA testing in 1995, established beyond reasonable doubt that the man buried in Kearney, Missouri, was indeed Jesse Woodson James. But the impulse behind those stories, the refusal to believe that Jesse James could truly be dead, truly be caught, truly be found, says something important about who he was in the American imagination. The hideouts he used were not just clever tactics, they were a philosophy. Jesse James understood something that the institutions of law enforcement in his era were not equipped to comprehend. He understood that a man embedded in a community, known, trusted, part of the fabric of local life, is almost impossible to find from the outside. The cave in the Ozark Bluffs could hide a body. But the loyalty of a farming family in Clay County could hide an identity. He understood that geography is power. The man who knows where the hidden crossings are, where the river can be forded in the dark, where the cave mouth is invisible from the main trail, that man has an advantage that no posse, however well armed, can easily overcome. And he understood that the most dangerous hiding place is the one that looks like it is not hiding anything at all. A modest house on a quiet street. A man named Howard who buys groceries at the local store and tips his hat to ladies on the sidewalk. These lessons did not end with Jesse James. The outlaws who came after him, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Belle Starr, the Dalton Gang, studied the same principles, consciously or not. Find your sympathetic community, know your terrain, keep your false identity clean and ordinary. The Wild West produced many legends, but very few of them survived as long as Jesse James did against such sustained, well-funded, determined opposition. If you stand today in the hills of Clay County, Missouri, and look out over the rolling farmland and the tree-lined river bottoms, it is not difficult to imagine what it looked like in 1875. The land has not changed that much. The limestone bluffs still rise above the river. The forests still crowd the hollows. Somewhere in that landscape, Jesse James walked his horse through the darkness and knew exactly where he was going and exactly who would be waiting to let him in. The sheriff did not know. The Pinkerton men did not know. The reward posters plastered to every tree and post office wall did not know. Only Jesse knew. And the people he trusted, and the land itself. There is something almost mythological about that, a man so deeply rooted in a place that the place protects him. A man whose knowledge of the land is so intimate that the hills and rivers become allies. But the myth obscures the reality. The reality is that Jesse James was a violent man who killed people, who terrorized innocent civilians, who left a trail of grief and fear across the American frontier. The romance of the outlaw life erases the victims. It erases the people who lost their savings in bank robberies, the train passengers held at gunpoint, the men who died. In the crossfire of Jesse's ambitions, the hiding places were real, the cleverness was real, the survival instinct was extraordinary. But so was the human cost of the life he led, and that, perhaps, is the deepest mystery of Jesse James. Not where he hid, though that story is remarkable enough, but why we are still telling it. Why does a man who died over 140 years ago still capture our imagination? Why do we seek out his caves, visit his childhood home, read his story in books, and watch it in films and listen to videos like this one? Maybe because Jesse James is a mirror. He reflects something back at us about the country that produced him, a country born in violence, divided by war, shaped by injustice, and prone to turning its most dangerous men into heroes. A country that has always had a complicated relationship with the law. A country where the outlaw and the lawman sometimes look uncomfortably alike. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe we are drawn to the story of a man who looked at a world that was trying to catch him and found a way to disappear. There is something deeply human in that, the desire to escape, to vanish, to find the hidden place where no one can reach you. Jesse James found those places. He used them brilliantly. He survived far longer than anyone predicted he could. And in the end, it was not the sheriffs who got him. It was not the Pinkertons. It was not the bounty hunters or the reward money or the relentless pressure of the law. It was someone he trusted, someone he let inside the hiding place. In a life built on secrets and hidden passages and false names and loyal silence, the one thing Jesse James could not fully control was the loyalty of the people around him. He trusted Robert Ford, and that was the one wall the caves and the river bluffs and the Ozark hollows could not protect him from. So what do you think? Was Jesse James a ruthless outlaw who terrorized the frontier and deserved everything that came to him? Or was he something more complicated, a man shaped by war and injustice, a survivor in a brutal world, a legend born from the chaos and violence of a nation still tearing itself apart? Was he a criminal or a product of his times? The hiding places are empty now. The farms are quiet. The caves are tourist attractions. But the questions he leaves behind are still alive, still unresolved, still worth asking. Tell me in the comments what you think. Was Jesse James a hero, a villain, or something in between? And if you want to keep going deeper into the real stories of the Wild West, the outlaws, the lawmen, the legends, and the forgotten people who lived through it all, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting, and every one of them will surprise you. The Wild West was wilder than you know, and we are just getting started.